It all started with a secret, a quiet DNA test in 2004, and then the silence shattered. Antony Armstrong-Jones, photographer, aristocrat, royal husband, had fathered a daughter. But not just any daughter. She was born during his honeymoon with Princess Margaret. And her mother? The wife of his best friend. What was once whispered in salons and shaded behind palace curtains now exploded in tabloid headlines. But that, shockingly, was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind every royal photo he took, behind every elegant smile he framed, Antony was weaving a web of deception so vast, so calculated, that by the time the monarchy realized it, he had nearly pulled it down from within. He wasn't born royal, but he slept beside it, seduced it, betrayed it, and exposed its deepest weaknesses to the world. This is the story of the man who nearly destroyed the monarchy. Antony Armstrong-Jones wasn't born into royalty, but for a while it felt like he might as well have been. His father was a prestigious barrister, his mother a magnetic socialite. From the outside, they looked like the ideal English family, groomed for greatness, destined for power. But beneath the tailored suits and afternoon teas, everything was beginning to crack. Just before Antony turned 5, his parents divorced. A wound for any child, but for Antony, it was the beginning of a long, bitter education in abandonment. He and his older sister were shuffled off to live with their mother, who didn't waste time. She remarried swiftly, tying the knot with Lawrence Parsons, the 6th Earl of Ross. Suddenly, Antony was part of nobility. A shiny title, a new father, a step into the aristocracy. But nobility didn't come with warmth. Instead of feeling elevated, Antony felt exiled. His mother had 2 more children with Parsons, children born with real noble blood. And Antony, the odd boy out, was treated like a remnant of her past. The golden crest on the family door didn't open hearts. It just drew a deeper line between Antony and everyone else. And then came the illness. During a holiday in Wales, young Antony contracted polio. The carefree charm of childhood collapsed into 6 long months at the Liverpool Royal Infirmary. He was paralyzed, in pain, alone. His mother never visited. His father never showed. Only his sister came. It wasn't just the disease that scarred him. It was the silence from the people who were supposed to love him most. By the time he recovered, he had a permanent limp and an even deeper emotional limp no doctor could fix. And instead of healing those wounds, his parents packed him off to boarding schools. One after another, cold institutions filled with old walls and stiff traditions. Eton, then Cambridge. At Eton, he found fleeting relief in hobbies, rowing, boxing, and photography. A flicker of freedom behind the lens. But even then, his leg ached. And so did the knowledge that he didn't quite belong. Cambridge was no better. He enrolled to study natural history, but lasted only 10 days before switching to architecture. He tried. He failed. He felt like an imposter even among the elite. His parents, both now strangers, barely tolerated his choices. And when he told them he wanted to be a photographer, they offered not encouragement, but cold disapproval. As if all this wasn't enough, love betrayed him too. Lady Barbara North, the woman Antony had fallen for, chose another man. 3 months later, Antony had to stand behind a camera and photograph her wedding. That image? Probably the most painful one he ever shot. But in that moment, humiliated, overlooked, alone, Antony made a silent vow. He would never be the outsider again. He would never let life pass him by. Whatever it took, prestige, fame, scandal, seduction, he would take it. And he did. Photography started as a refuge. Then it became an obsession, and soon after, a weapon. In the 1950s, Antony Armstrong-Jones clawed his way into London's high society, not with a title but with a camera. He shot stage stars, fashion icons, aristocrats. His lens had a way of capturing not just beauty but vulnerability. It disarmed his subjects, and it seduced them. His name was whispered in backstage dressing rooms, printed in society pages, and murmured in cocktail parties. He was handsome, mysterious, charming. But more than that, he was dangerous. Because behind the camera, he was always watching. Antony set up his studio on Pimlico Road, and it quickly became more than just a workplace. It was a playground. Models came and went. So did actresses. And sometimes, so did their clothes. Rumors swirled about wild parties, glasses clinking, jazz playing, lovers slipping into side rooms. And the whispers didn't stop there. They said he slept with men. They said he seduced his subjects. They said his charm was so potent it didn't care for gender, class, or consequences. In an era when homosexuality was still illegal in the UK, this wasn't just provocative, it was dangerous. But Antony didn't flinch. He was already living on the edge. Even as he danced with scandal, his artistic credibility soared. He wasn't just a man behind a lens, he was shaping culture. His portraits were bold, stark, emotional. His angles unorthodox. His work spoke louder than his name. And then came his golden ticket. Queen Elizabeth II herself commissioned Antony to photograph her family. The royal court, always so stiff and traditional, was intrigued by his eye. Modern, raw, intimate. For a brief moment, it seemed like Antony had finally been accepted, that the outsider had not only stepped into the castle, but had been invited to decorate its walls. But that was the danger, wasn't it? Because while the royals admired his talent, they underestimated his hunger. As he got closer to the crown, he became quieter, more careful. The parties slowed, the smiles stiffened. He kept a public girlfriend, Jackie Chan, a glittering showgirl. But behind closed doors, there was something else, something no one was ready for. He was falling in love. Not with a model, not with a muse, but with Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth's sister. And unlike his past flings, this wasn't just gossip waiting to happen. It was a ticking bomb. It started with conversation. Antony and Princess Margaret would meet in secret, away from the gold frames and court whispers. She would talk about the weight of royal duty. He would show her his latest photographs, raw, provocative, alive. In those quiet hours, a bond formed, not the kind sanctioned by palace protocol, but something far more dangerous. For Margaret, Antony was a breath of rebellion. She had just survived heartbreak with Captain Peter Townsend. The war hero the crown refused to let her marry. The wounds were fresh. The press had been brutal. The palace even more so. She wasn't just looking for love. She was looking to reclaim control. And Antony? He was the perfect accomplice. A man who understood pain, who had been abandoned, rejected, dismissed his whole life. But also a man who knew how to charm, how to navigate class, and, when needed, how to perform. Their secret meetings turned into stolen weekends. Their friendship bloomed into something else, something the press hadn't caught wind of. Not yet. But the royal family had learned their lesson from the Townsend scandal. They weren't going to let the press ruin this one, too. If Margaret was to love again, they would manage it on their terms, quietly, carefully. There was only one problem. Antony had to give up his career. Being a royal consort wasn't compatible with being a provocative artist. There were rules, expectations, masks to wear. No more risque portraits. No more private parties. No more studio liaisons with actresses and designers. So Antony began to disappear from his work, from his world, from himself. London society noticed his sudden withdrawal. The bold artist became a shadow. The flamboyant bachelor faded from the scene, and just as gossip began to bubble again, boom. A royal press release dropped in 1960. Princess Margaret was engaged to Antony Armstrong-Jones. The world gasped. No one saw it coming, not even the press, who had trailed Margaret's every move. For most, it was thrilling, a commoner, a creative, a love story. But not everyone was impressed. Antony's own father responded with cold skepticism. He said being in Buckingham Palace would be like living in a barracks. And strangely enough, he wasn't wrong. Because behind the crown, behind the cameras, something was already breaking. May 6th, 1960. The bells rang, the cameras rolled, and history was made. For the first time ever, a royal wedding was broadcast on television. Over 20 million people tuned in to watch Princess Margaret marry Antony Armstrong-Jones. It looked like a fairy tale, the radiant princess, the dashing commoner-turned-consort, the carriage, the crown. But behind the smiles and royal waves, storm clouds were already gathering. Antony had chosen his close friend Jeremy Fry to be his best man. But just weeks before the wedding, a background check revealed that Fry had once been caught soliciting another man in a public bathroom. The scandal was explosive, too explosive for the palace to risk. In typical royal fashion, the palace buried the truth. They issued a quiet excuse for Fry's absence, shuffled him out of the spotlight, and carried on with rehearsals as if nothing happened. But that incident left a lingering shadow over the ceremony, and it was just the beginning. The wedding itself, for all its glamour, felt more like a performance than a celebration. Margaret looked beautiful. Antony looked composed. The crowd cheered. The Queen smiled. But Antony's father stood stiff, cold, barely clapping. His earlier warning, that royal life would feel like a prison, was beginning to ring true. Still, the couple managed to escape for their honeymoon, a 6-week retreat through the Caribbean, far from the press, the palace, and the pressure. And for a moment, they looked like newlyweds in love. But even paradise couldn't shield them from reality. While they lounged in the sun, their absence from Britain raised eyebrows. They missed key events, including the birth of Jeremy Fry's child. And back home, whispers began to stir. Some in the British press still saw Antony as a commoner, unworthy of Margaret. Certain royal staff echoed that snobbery, treating him like a guest, not a member of the family. Servants murmured behind closed doors. One butler, after just 25 days of working in their new home, ran straight to the tabloids, eager to sell scandal. Antony and Margaret had barely unpacked, and the castle walls were already crumbling. Then came the true test: life inside Kensington Palace. They moved into apartment 10, ornate, historic, and suffocating. The weight of royal expectations clashed with Antony's artistic soul, and the one person who might have supported him, Prince Philip, didn't. Philip never liked Antony. He saw him as soft, pretentious, too sensitive, too flamboyant. The two men couldn't be more different. Philip, the rugged Navy man; Antony, the theatrical photographer. Tensions simmered under formal dinners and royal functions, and when the doors closed, it got worse. Antony had given up his career, his identity, his freedom, for love. But love, it seemed, wasn't enough. Margaret was slipping too, into loneliness, into bitterness. And it wouldn't be long before both of them started slipping into someone else's arms. Kensington Palace was supposed to be a sanctuary, but for Antony and Princess Margaret, it quickly became a gilded cage. Inside the walls of apartment 10, the tension was thick. Antony, who once thrived in the creative chaos of his studio, now found himself surrounded by courtiers, protocols, and butlers who barely disguised their disdain. Some saw him as an outsider, others as an intruder, and a few, like one particularly vindictive butler, saw him as an opportunity. That butler lasted only 25 days before the tabloids got to him. Eager for attention, he painted a sour picture of life inside the palace: strained dinners, snide comments, cold silences. The press ate it up. And suddenly, the public's fairy tale couple looked like a tragedy in slow motion. But the butler wasn't the only one watching closely. Prince Philip made no effort to hide his contempt for Antony. The two men couldn't be more misaligned. Philip was all discipline and duty. Antony was all art and nuance. Philip hunted, sailed, and grilled. Antony painted, photographed, and pondered. They didn't clash, they repelled. Antony, already suffocating under the crown's expectations, found himself isolated. He had no real allies in the royal family. Even Margaret, who once defended him, began to drift. When she became pregnant with their first child, hopes flickered. Maybe, just maybe, parenthood would anchor them. In November 1961, she gave birth to their son, David. Antony, now styled as the Earl of Snowdon. It was a rare moment of joy. But it didn't last. Margaret and Antony weren't naturals at parenting. They hired nannies, left for trips, and treated motherhood and fatherhood like ceremonial titles. Soon after the birth, they embarked on another Caribbean escape. And when they returned, things only got worse. Antony struggled to find a role that satisfied both his creativity and the expectations of the royal household. He took on design projects, some public service work, but it never seemed enough. Margaret, in turn, grew bitter. She felt ignored, not just by Antony, but by her own family. Loneliness settled into the palace like a cold draft. Margaret took solace in cocktails and cigarette smoke. The media, once captivated by her glamour, began to turn. Her public image frayed. But the press didn't blame her. They blamed Antony. He had pulled her away from her royal destiny, they said. He had dimmed her star. And inside Kensington Palace, where tension lived in every hallway, even Margaret began to believe it. They didn't share hobbies. They didn't share goals. But they did share one thing, a growing appetite for distraction. And London, in the swinging 60s, had plenty of it. By the mid-1960s, Antony and Margaret weren't just drifting apart. They were leading separate lives. London was changing. It was swinging, pulsing with rock and roll, fashion, film, and freedom. And both Antony and Margaret dove headfirst into it, but never together. Antony surrounded himself with editors, stylists, and magazine elites. He wasn't just the Queen's brother-in-law. He was still Antony Armstrong-Jones, the photographer who once electrified London's art scene. But now, the whispers returned. He was getting too close to Pamela Collin, a married Vogue editor. The palace spun a story. Margaret couldn't join him on a trip because of Queen-related duties. But everyone inside the circle knew the truth. Margaret knew it too, and she was done playing victim. In a move that stunned even Antony, Margaret struck back. She rekindled flirty friendships with actor Peter Sellers, then shared scandalous whispers with her daughter's godfather, Anthony Barton. But even those were just warm-ups. Soon, rumors swirled about her liaisons with some of the biggest names of the era: Warren Beatty, Mick Jagger, Leslie Hutchinson. Whether truth or gossip, the tabloids went wild, and Margaret, once the media's darling, was suddenly their favorite target. But the most dangerous chapter came with Robin Douglas Home, the nephew of a former prime minister. Their affair wasn't subtle. Antony walked in on them at Kensington Palace. And Robin? He filed for divorce from his own wife. It was clear this wasn't just a fling, it was a threat. Antony, ever the strategist, acted quickly. He intercepted a love letter Robin wrote to Margaret and handed it straight to the Queen Mother. He demanded Margaret end the affair, spinning the moment to frame her as the reckless one. If he couldn't fix the marriage, he could at least control the narrative. It worked, temporarily. Margaret ended the relationship, but the damage was done. 18 months later, Robin Douglas Home took his own life at age 36, a devastating tragedy. But did it stop the cycle? Not even close. Infidelity became a rhythm, not an event, but a lifestyle. Antony left her cruel messages in books. At parties, he'd interrupt her mid-sentence with barbed insults. "Shut up and let someone intelligent talk!" Margaret, humiliated, retreated further into bitterness. And the royal family? Strangely, they sided with Antony. He was charming. He was presentable. He played the game better than Margaret ever could. The palace hoped the two would simply live apart quietly, saving face. But face was all they had left. And even that was starting to crack. By now, their marriage was no longer about love or even betrayal. It was about control. Antony and Princess Margaret had stopped trying to fix things. Instead, they weaponized their words, their silence, and each other's pain. They weren't partners anymore. They were opponents in an endless chess match where every move cut deeper than the last. Antony no longer hid his disdain. He began leaving cruel messages for Margaret inside books. One in particular was unforgettable. Inside a novel, he scribbled, "You look like a Jewish manicurist, and I hate you." Margaret found it. She always found them. But she said nothing, at least not with words. She retaliated in public. At parties, when Margaret tried to hold court with stories or charm, Antony would cut in sharply. "Shut up and let someone intelligent talk." The room would freeze. Faces would turn pale. But Antony would just sip his drink and smile, as if it were all a joke. To the outside world, they were still a royal couple. But those close to them saw the truth. Two people who couldn't stand the sight of each other, yet couldn't leave either. A royal tragedy, without an intermission. Margaret didn't just suffer in silence. She lashed out too, through alcohol, sharp words, and scandalous flirtations. The more she drank, the more erratic her behavior became. Public rudeness, slurred speeches, tabloid meltdowns. And the press? They turned on her viciously. The former media darling was now painted as spoiled, unstable, and irresponsible. Headlines mocked her. Anti-monarchists pointed to her as proof of royal decay. But inside the palace, Margaret wasn't getting sympathy. She was getting blamed. The royal family quietly favored Antony. He knew how to smile in photographs. He knew when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to deflect. Margaret, in contrast, was emotional, impulsive, and proudly rebellious. She had become the problem, not the victim. The palace's solution? Ignore it. Pretend it was fine. Hope the couple would simply lead separate lives, under the same roof, behind thick palace walls. But Margaret couldn't carry the weight, the secrets, the loneliness, the daily humiliation. And instead of confronting it head-on, she drowned it, in scotch, in bitterness, and in denial. Meanwhile, Antony seemed to thrive in the chaos. If he was suffering, he didn't show it. Or perhaps he had simply grown used to wearing the mask. What had begun as a love story had now become a silent war. And neither side was willing to surrender. For years, they danced around the inevitable. Separate lives, separate beds, separate lovers. But it wasn't until Mustique, the quiet Caribbean island gifted to them as a honeymoon present, that everything finally collapsed. Margaret had long turned Mustique into her personal escape. Far from the stiff corridors of Kensington Palace, far from Antony's insults and cold stares, the island became her refuge. Sunlight, sea air, and silence. No tabloids, no royal duties. And then came Roddy. Roddy Llewellyn was 25. Margaret was 43. He was the son of a renowned British equestrian, but more importantly, he was kind, free-spirited, and unlike Antony, he listened. Their connection began innocently, shared meals, shared laughter, and for the first time in years, shared warmth. But it didn't stay innocent for long. They became lovers. And for Margaret, it wasn't just another affair, it was relief. Roddy made her feel seen again, not as a fading royal, not as a scandal magnet, but as a woman. With Roddy, she could breathe. But the world was about to choke her. Rupert Murdoch, ever the media predator, smelled blood in the water. He dispatched a journalist from New Zealand to infiltrate Mystique, posing as a vacationing couple. They blended in, sipped rum punch, smiled at parties, and then they got the shot. A photograph. Margaret and Roddy, relaxed, laughing, undeniably intimate. When the image hit the front pages, it wasn't just a scandal. It was a torpedo. The press exploded. "Princess and the Toy Boy! Royal Cougar Romance!" It was brutal, mocking, relentless. For Antony, it was a gift. The palace had long delayed action on the couple's failing marriage, preferring quiet separation to public divorce. But now, with photographic proof of infidelity splashed across the world, the excuse was served on a silver platter. Antony moved fast. Without warning Margaret or the palace, he issued a public statement announcing their separation. Cold, clean, strategic. The royal family, blindsided but grateful for an exit, fell in line. And just like that, the fairy tale ended. But here's the twist. Antony didn't even want a divorce. He was content to stay legally separated forever. He believed the palace would never allow a royal divorce. It was too messy, too modern. But in a surprise turn, they granted it, and in 1978, the marriage officially dissolved. Within 5 months, Antony married Lucy Lindsay Hogg, his longtime lover and production assistant. Margaret was stunned, not just by the speed, but by the finality. After all the years of war, Antony had won. He got the last word, the last move, and the last spotlight. But what no one knew, what Margaret would never see, was that Antony's web of secrets had only just begun to unravel. Antony didn't wait. Barely 5 months after divorcing Princess Margaret, he walked down the aisle again, this time with Lucy Lindsay Hogg, his elegant, soft-spoken production assistant. The world barely had time to blink. One royal chapter closed, and another began. But this wasn't a fairy tale either. At first, it seemed promising. Lucy was everything Margaret wasn't: patient, discreet, and uninterested in palace drama. She gave Antony a sense of calm. The press moved on. The scandal quieted. He even had a daughter with Lucy. A fresh start? Not quite. Because Antony never really changed. Somewhere between his separation and divorce from Margaret, he had begun yet another affair, this time with a married journalist named Anne Hills. It wasn't a fleeting tryst. It would last 20 years. Anne thought she was different, that she was the one. She loved Antony deeply, waited endlessly, and even endured watching him marry Lucy, hoping one day her moment would come. It never did. She had other lovers, other relationships, even other homes, but she always came back to him. Antony, ever the emotional puppeteer, kept the flame low but burning, just enough to keep her close, never enough to commit, until it all fell apart. In 1996, Anne lost her longtime newspaper column. Her relationship had recently ended. Christmas had passed, again, without Antony. And with nowhere else to turn, she made a heartbreaking decision. Anne Hills took her own life. She left a note expressing her love for Antony and asked that a family heirloom he had once gifted her be returned. When investigators combed through her things, they found her diaries, 2 decades worth of raw, intimate details about her secret life with the Earl of Snowdon. When those pages hit the press, they detonated like a bomb. The public was stunned. So was Lucy. For years, she believed she knew her husband. Now she was reading, along with the rest of Britain, about his long-standing betrayal. And Antony? He offered no apologies, no explanations. He simply carried on, as if heartbreak didn't stick to him. But karma wasn't done. 2 years later, Lucy discovered another secret. Antony had fathered a child with Melanie Cable Alexander, a magazine editor nearly 30 years younger than him. The child was his. The affair had been hidden in plain sight. This time, Lucy didn't stay silent. She confronted him, and he confessed. Antony found himself caught, again, between two women, two lives, and mounting financial strain. Supporting an ex-wife, a mistress, multiple children, and still maintaining his public image, it was too much. In a move that stunned even Lucy, Antony encouraged Melanie to sell their story to Hello magazine for $330,000 in today's dollars to offset the financial chaos. Lucy had had enough. She filed for divorce, quietly, decisively. And Antony? He didn't stop. Even as age and illness crept in, the man who once captured the queen through a lens could never stop chasing shadows of desire. By the time Antony Armstrong-Jones reached his twilight years, his body was failing, crippled slowly by the same polio that haunted him as a child. But his scandals? They hadn't aged a day. He moved from woman to woman, clinging to younger lovers, despite his increasing frailty. It was as if the man who once conquered London with a camera couldn't bear to be unseen. And just when the world thought they had heard it all, another secret surfaced. In 2004, long after the headlines had faded, a quiet DNA test sent shockwaves through royal watchers and friends alike. It confirmed what some had whispered, but none had dared to prove. Antony had fathered a daughter during his honeymoon with Princess Margaret. Not just during the marriage, but right at the beginning. The mother? Camilla Fry, the wife of his closest friend, Jeremy Fry. The betrayal was staggering. While Antony and Margaret were being celebrated on their Caribbean honeymoon, a child was being born back in Britain. His child. And the woman who gave birth to her was married to the very man Antony had once chosen as his best man, before the palace forced Fry out over a scandal of his own. It was treachery wrapped in velvet. And the woman, Polly Higson, grew up not knowing the truth of her paternity until much later in life. But when it surfaced, it painted Antony's legacy in a far darker shade than any royal ever anticipated. Even his loyal ex-wife Lucy, who had nursed him in his final years, could not defend him after that. In 2017, Antony Armstrong-Jones died peacefully at the age of 86 in his Kensington home. He outlived Margaret by 15 years. Lucy, remarkably, stayed by his side as a friend. But the man she cared for in the end was not the man she married. In his last years, more rumors emerged, suggestions that Antony may have been bisexual, with a few male interior designers hinting at relationships, though never confirmed. It added yet another layer to a life already bursting with dualities. Loyal and betraying, sensitive and cruel, public and secretive. And perhaps that was the essence of Antony. He lived between the frames, between the portrait and the truth. He had photographed the queen, seduced the princess, betrayed his friends, and manipulated nearly everyone in his orbit. He was the man who had everything, but couldn't stop wanting more. He didn't destroy the monarchy with fire or rebellion. He did it with charm, with silence, with scandal whispered behind velvet doors. And in doing so, he left us with one haunting question. What happens when the man behind the lens becomes the most dangerous figure in the royal portrait? In the end, Antony Armstrong-Jones didn't wear a crown, but he left deeper scars on the monarchy than most who did. He wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was something far more dangerous. He was charming. He was unpredictable. He was allowed too close for far too long. He seduced not just the princess, but the entire royal image. For years, he stood beside one of the most powerful families on earth, while quietly unraveling their illusion from within. And when the dust settled, All that remained was a trail of broken hearts, lost children, and stories too scandalous for fairy tales. Antony didn't just photograph royalty, he exposed it. And in doing so, he taught us that sometimes the most destructive forces are the ones we welcome through the front door. If you found this story as haunting and fascinating as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next royal secret waiting to be revealed. And tell us in the comments, was Antony Armstrong-Jones a victim of his own pain, or a master manipulator who played the royal game better than anyone else ever could? We read every comment. And the next story might just be one you inspire. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next scandal.